All right, I'm happy to be talking again with Mark Potok. We've got an episode coming up on Doug Wilson, but this one's going straight to YouTube. So thanks, Mark, for dropping in and chat with me again.
Oh, real pleasure.
So can you tell, for people that don't know who you are, I know you were with the Southern Poverty Law Center for years and years and years. You're no longer with that organization. What are you doing now?
Well, similar things. When I was at the Southern Poverty Law Center, of course, that's a very big civil rights organization based in Alabama. And I really led our efforts aimed at combating the radical right. So I ran a department that was for a while called Klan Watch for many years and later called the Intelligence Report. And I also led an investigative magazine there. So yes, and since then I left about 3 years ago, 2017, spring of 2017, and I have been a senior fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right since then, which is perhaps a little less grand than it sounds. Essentially, it's a large group of scholars, European and American scholars, who study the radical right. So I write for them pretty regularly, as well as other outlets, but always connected to the radical right. That's really my specialty.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about on the radical right, isn't there? Not just obviously in America, is there? I mean, this is off the subject, but I mean, I've been watching, you've got a lot of far right governments and strongman type leaders. Donald Trump was not by any stretch of the imagination the only strongman or strongman wannabe, was there? You've got Putin and Erdogan and all over the place.
It's Poland, it's Hungary, it's India, someplace we're not used to thinking about the radical right existing in. It's most of the Scandinavian countries, it's Belgium, France, Germany. All of these countries have small to medium-sized neo-Nazi or similar movements. You know, and it's a response, you know, the conversation for another day, but it's a response to the same huge historical forces that are also driving the rise of the radical right in the United States.
Absolutely, which is kind of in a roundabout way what we're going to be talking about in this chat. We're talking about the Christian identity movement. This is something we kind of touched on a little bit in the last episode. We said, oh, we need to get into that. This is something that is an area of interest. Obviously, you've studied it. What can you tell us about where this movement came from and why should people be concerned about it? I guess that's where we're going to end up, I think, isn't it?
Sure. It's a bit of a long story, so bear with me. Christian identity is a racist theology. Let me just say that by way of preview, and wildly anti-Semitic. But previous to the formation of Christian identity, its earliest form was something called British Israelism. British Israelism was a theological idea that arose in the 1840s in the United Kingdom, in England. There was a particular man, a guy named John Wilson, who went around giving a series of lectures. And the core of the idea of British Israelism had to do with the 10 lost tribes of the Old Testament. The Hebrew tribes that simply disappear from the Bible after they're attacked by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and so on. They never reappear in the Bible at all. Of course, the Hebrews who do keep reappearing in the Bible later on are from the Southern Kingdom, the two other tribes. Right. So it's a bit of a mystery what happened to the 10 tribes, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Well, what this guy Wilson and other British Israelites argued was that what actually happened to those 10 northern tribes was they migrated to the north. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains, thus becoming known as Caucasians, and migrated into Northern Europe and the British Isles. And so the fundamental idea was that Wilson was saying, hey, guess what? We Britons and our friends over in the Germanic countries in Northern Europe and Scandinavia and so on, we are actually the long lost brothers of the Hebrews of the Bible. In other words, we too, we're their relatives. We too are the chosen people. So at this point, British Israelism was not anti-Semitic, it was philo-Semitic. Just the opposite, right? We love the Jews, and guess what? We are the Jews too.
Yeah.
And, you know, really the thinking, I think an important thing to understand about the kind of role this theology played in British society, and it became very popular, especially among, you know, lords and ladies and titled people. It was quite a fad, 1840s all the way up through the 1920s in England. This purpose it really served, I think, historically, was it was a justification for the British ruling the world, right? They had a
British Empire.
Empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire.
Yep.
Well, why did the British have any kind of right to rule over other peoples? Well, this was a theological justification. Hey, we are the chosen people of the Bible. We're leading humanity to where it ought to go, according to God himself, and so on. So that's the function it served. In any case, there was a second round, another guy named Edward Hine, who became the chief proponent of British Israelism in Israel, in Britain, sorry. And ultimately, Hine, in the mid-1880s, traveled to the United States to propound this doctrine. And in fact, to some extent, it took off a little bit. People were interested in that idea here. Of course, it was changed a little bit. It wasn't only the British Isles and Northern Europe, but also the United States. Happy day. White people in the United States were also the chosen people. So that was considered a pretty groovy idea. And it grew not wildly, but it did ultimately produce it did ultimately have some real churches and built up around it, principally the Worldwide Church of God, which was run for many years until his death by Herbert W. Armstrong. Armstrong died in 1986, and with it, really, that was the last gasp of British Israelism in the United States. In any case, it's kind of a side story, because in the 1920s and 1930s, you began to see British Israelism seized upon by white supremacists. In particular, a number of West Coast preachers, several of whom had been in the Klan. So they're coming from a Protestant background, obviously. Klan groups were uniformly Protestant at that time. And there were a number of things that happened, but basically, the idea of we're the long-lost brothers of the Jews, hallelujah, essentially what began to happen was that these preachers stripped away the legitimacy or the claim of the two southern tribes to being descendants of the Hebrews of the Old Testament. So in other words, they started to develop the idea that only the descendants of the 10 lost tribes were really God's chosen people, and that the people who call themselves Jews today are lying. It's all a big story. They were never the chosen people. And, goes through several dimensions, several kind of developments as the Jews are pictured as more and more evil. Ultimately, and this is the kind of critical moment, in the 1960s, a man named Wesley Swift on the West Coast made the final leap, which was to say, not only are the people who call themselves Jews today not the descendants of the Hebrews of the Bible and not the chosen people, they are in fact descended directly from Satan himself. And so this is known as two-seed or seed line identity, the most extreme form of identity, and this is the kind that dominates in hate groups today. Or to the extent that Christian identity is still a big part of hate groups today. So the idea, really what it comes down to is a reinterpretation, or really to be candid, a complete rewriting of Genesis, such that Eve in the Garden of Eden does not merely take a bite from the apple, an apple from the tree of knowledge and so on. That's just as the identity people would say today. That's, that's people rewriting the Bible for the ears of children, people who can't handle the real truth. If you only knew, if you only saw the original Aramaic and Hebrew and so on, you would know that what really happened, God help us, in the Garden of Eden, was Eve had sex with the serpent, literally, physically. She is impregnated. She, of course, runs over to Adam and shows him all about this new thing, sex, and is impregnated again. So the story, it all starts in the Garden of Eden. Cain is the father of the Jews. He's the evil one, and he is not the product of Adam and Eve, but of Eve and the serpent. Abel is the good guy. He really was the child of Adam and Eve. And so identity pictures all of human history from the Garden of Eden forth as being this titanic struggle between the seed line of Cain, the satanic father of the Jews, and the seed line of Abel, which is, the godly white man, and so on. So all of human history is a titanic struggle between these forces. And ultimately, what the Jews are doing, according to Christian identity, is they are in a battle to destroy all that is good and right and white and Aryan and so on in the world, in preparation for their father, Satan, to come to earth and rule the earth. So that's the idea.
Wow.
They are postmillennialists in the sense that they believe that, we humans here on earth, especially we Aryans, if one is Aryan, need to defeat the forces of evil. Jews principally, but also people of color and so on, in order to finally prepare the earth for the arrival of second coming of Christ and the millennial reign and so on, and time of great happiness and the end of history and all of that. So those are some of the core ideas. Well, I should mention also that so far I've only talked about white people and Jews or Hebrews.
Yeah. What about people of color?
People of color are pictured by to seed-line identity people as having been created by God with the beasts of the field on the fifth day, I think.
Right.
In other words, they call people of color pre-Adamic. It's like God was had to take a couple of practice runs, and they didn't turn out too well, right? He wound up with brown people, black people, yellow people, red people, none of them really quite people at all. And identity explicitly says that people, non-white people, have no souls. They're not really human. They're commonly called in identity circles mud people, right? This is God, trying to fashion people out of a hunk of mud or something like that, not doing too well. And he finally gets it together with white people, And so it's an incredibly bellicose theology, because it really calls its people to murder the Jews, to murder the race mixers, because that's a part of it also, the idea that, you don't get mad at your donkey or your horse, right? But you don't want your daughter to marry one. So it's the same idea of, your daughter your white daughter marries a black man or vice versa. Very, very, very bad.
Yeah, race mixing is not good. Yeah.
Within identity, there's another idea which was came up in the 1990s. A guy named Richard Kelly Hoskins wrote a book called The Vigilantes of Christendom. That book is a big, fat, difficult to read, and insanely racist book, which describes, it's based on a few verses from Numbers 21 in the Bible. And those verses tell the story of Phineas, an Israeli priest who sees an Israeli man having sex with a Midianite woman, a woman from another tribe. And he runs them through, in the act, both at once with a single spear, and kills them. And I think, I'm no theologian, but I think within mainstream theological circles, this is, this was God saying, don't mix with other cultures, don't mix with people who don't believe in the same gods as we do. But in the identity world, and Hoskins's book, this is, the Phineas priests are an elite group of people, of Aryans, who should go around and murder mixed race couples, because this is the biggest abomination there could be. And in fact, there have been several actual groups called the Phineas priesthood that have engaged in various bombings and even killings and so on. So that's, a piece of it, a piece of the identity mythology.
So much to it.
To say about identity. It's very complicated and weird, and I think obviously from any Christian point of view, wildly heretical.
There's so much in what you just said. My head's kind of spinning because I've been reading up on this all day today, getting ready for talking to you too. One of the things I was going to say is, that core belief that Adam was a white man, that he was. That's one of the pivotal pieces of it too, isn't it? That, as you say, God was kind of experimenting around with the mud people, and then all of a sudden he got it right finally with Adam. And then there's that serpent seed. One of the things I found too was they're post-millennialist in the main, aren't they? But this kind of era of tribulation, that's more like going to be a race war rather than armies of the Antichrist.
They see tribulation, so they're post-tribulationists as well, right? They see there's got to be this massive battle between good and evil, and that's, essentially white people against the Jews and their enemies and so on, before the millennial reign can happen, and return and so on.
Well, I know this thing about race mixing. Now, that's something that you're talking about that kind of resonates with me, because I've done a bunch of research on the origins of the Christian right. How much of this is influenced into the Christian right? Because, for example, I came across a sermon that Bob Jones preached. I think it was about 1963, 1964. And the whole theme of the sermon is you shouldn't mix races. Everyone kind of stay in your lane, don't intermarry, don't intermingle. And that's somehow God's design. Everyone's going to be happier. Everyone's going to be blessed. Just don't intermarry, don't intermingle, don't mix races. So that's a fairly mainstream fundamentalist Christian, Bob Jones.
Well, I think you have a better sense of this than I do, because you really, you're a genuine theologian or know something real about the subject. My sense is no, that it wasn't so much identity, because, there's a lot of that from people like Robert Dabney during the Civil War. Dabney was Stonewall Jackson's. We talked about him last time.
Mm-hmm.
And identity didn't exist back then. So there were plenty of people, in a very, very long tradition of people finding passages in the Bible that support the idea, at least in their minds, of separation of the races and so on. The elephants with the elephants and the giraffes with the giraffes, and never the twain shall mix. So I think Christian Reconstruction, which we've talked about on another occasion, had much more influence, or much more direct influence, I should say, on right-wing Christian politics, right-wing Republican politics. This is getting pretty far out there, and so for anybody who claims any, to anybody who's raised in a Christian denomination, I think this would seem more than shocking. I mean, you have to be really pretty out there to believe this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, but on the extreme right, it's filled with people like that who are looking for a reason, a justification for their various hatreds, of which there are many. And identity is very good at providing that, because it's really good against evil. It's not that some people are a little sinful or could act better on certain occasions. It's that you have, the evil race trying to destroy the rest of us on behalf of Satan.
Yeah. Well, now people are thinking maybe, well, why should I be concerned about this? Because looking at the numbers right now, certainly in America, it is somewhat spread around the world, but it's not a massive, massive movement. There's not like millions and millions of people. So you could kind of dismiss it and say, well, it's had its heyday. But one of the things I found in doing the research on it was that it was instrumental in helping some of the people that were involved in the early Christian identity movement were also instrumental in getting the militia movement off the ground. Now, so a lot of the militias, you could say like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, they're not explicitly Christian identity, but they have been influenced to some extent by some of the teachings and tenets of this movement, I think.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, let me try and tell the story. It's a bit of a long story. First of all, I think the best estimates are between about 25 and 50,000 identity believers. And it's probably more towards the lower number. I would say 10, 15 years ago, it was closer to 50,000, maybe even 55, 60,000. What's happened within the radical right is that it's such a complicated theology. And, they've got incredible minutiae involved in all the writings about Christian identity, that for young people today, it doesn't have a whole lot of interest. It's like what your crazy old Aunt B would believe in, right? I mean, it's really out
Crazy
there.
uncle.
Yeah. And, so they're much more attracted to other theologies that seem much more simple and might as right, like, various forms of paganism, Odinism, Asatru, that sort of thing.
Right.
Topics for another day. So I do think it's less popular out there. That said, its identity has been at the core of a whole bunch of groups, and I'll get to the militia movement in a second. But identity in the really the first strong proponent of identity on the clearly radical right was George Lincoln Rockwell, who we've discussed a little bit before, the leader of the American Nazi Party in the 1960s. And Rockwell adopted identity despite being absolutely an atheist. But he did it as a purely cynical matter because he understood what is true, which is that Americans have much higher levels of religiosity generally than Europeans do, and that there was no way that he was going to sell the ideas of Nazism, of National Socialism to Americans unless he could show that there was a theological basis for it. So that became important in many of these groups, and many of the groups were not quite so cynical as Rockwell really were, or thought of themselves as Christians. But for them, this really fit, right? It's the Old Testament that I grew up with. I just had it, I was misreading it slightly in the past, and now I understand who the true nation of Israel is: white people.
It's us.
So what I was going to say is that, you know, Christian identity went into now it dominates the majority of Klan groups. Christian identity was the belief system of many of the members of the Order, which was the scariest white supremacist terrorist group in the history of our country. This was in the 1980s. Christian identity was the theology of the CSA, the cross, the sword, and the arm of the Lord. It was the ideology of the Montana Freemen. It was arguably the ideology of Eric Rudolph, the guy who bombed the Atlanta Olympics and gay bar, abortion clinic here in Alabama, and so on. And it was the belief system of the militia of Montana and its founder, John Trockman. You know, Trockman was extremely important to the militia movement. Militia Montana was one of the two militias that first appeared in this country in the 1990s and really began the modern militia. But let me step back for a moment to say identity also was the belief system of a very large group, so large that it really became a movement, a radical right movement in the 1970s and 1980s. And that was the Posse Comitatus. Posse Comitatus was a group started by William Potter Gale, a guy who'd been an aide to General MacArthur in the Philippines. It was formed in 1970, and it grew quite a bit. And there are a number of reasons why it grew. The most important one I'll just touch on briefly was that the Posse went into the farm belt of the United States at a time of real crisis in the farm economy under the Carter administration. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families losing their land, oftentimes land that had been in their families for 6, 7, 8, 9 generations. So there was a lot of anger and a lot of angst out there. And the Posse went out into these states, places like Kansas, and really worked their way into the farm movement, the movement to help farmers, and you know, which started out as quite a progressive thing, right? We need the government to just give us price supports, help farmers survive these difficult times. But what it became, thanks to the Posse, was, you know, the Posse was able to convince tens of thousands of American farmers that the reason their farms were failing was the Jews. Right? And that resulted in a number of murders, and all kinds of really terrible things happened. So the Posse also had other ideas, like it was the Posse and Gale who came up with the idea of county supremacy, the idea that there is no higher authority in the land than a county sheriff. And that has to do with the idea that the sheriff's elected, and you know, the law enforcement isn't, and agencies like the FBI are, you know, the worst, right? They don't come from the people. So these ideas, county supremacy, those kinds of things became the core ideas of the militia movement. So it's absolutely true that a lot of the ideas of the militia movement come direct from the Posse, and a lot of the ideas of the Posse, in fact, most of them came directly from Christian identity. Now, you know, I don't want to go too far, because it's certainly true that enormous numbers of people who consider themselves in the militia movement or militia groups don't even know what Christian identity is, right? Have no idea, would know what we were talking about. Nevertheless, there's a through line, as you suggested.
You could draw a line. Well, it's kind of like what we talked about on Doug Wilson. There's a lot of Christians, homeschoolers, for example, today, never heard of the name R.J. Rushdoony, don't know what Christian Reconstructionism is, and yet there they are. You know, there they were storming the Capitol building on the 6th of January. You saw the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters. Yes, as we say, they were not necessarily Christian identity, you know, explicitly, but they owe their existence to that movement in large part, surely. So yeah, you can draw a through line, it seems to me, to what we saw in the Capitol riots.
Yeah, I think there's some truth. Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah.
I also think it's a kind of fascinating detail of what we've talked about, that the Klan became dominated by Christian identity. Mm-hmm. The Klan, which was once all about, right, Protestantism. I mean, we are Protestants. That's what 100% Americanism was. And for more than half their life, their principal enemy was Catholicism. So they got to throw it all out the window. And, because no mainstream Protestant obviously could look at identity and react in any other way than with horror. Yeah. So it's a strange thing. I think that probably identity will fade away as a kind of discrete theology. But we're left with, the ways that it's influenced all of these groups and how to make them feel that they're, doing the will of the Bible and so on. And, to kind of refer back to something you're talking about, the Capitol invasion, the insurrection on January 6th and so on, it's worth remembering how many of those people carried Christian flags and Christian symbols and talked about themselves as, Christian nationalists and so on. So, it's a bit of a toxic brew.
Well, and to what extent does conspiracy theorist type thinking play into this whole thing? Because going back to you're talking about the theology, Genesis, and we'll tell you the truth. It's that strikes me instantly as conspiratorial type of thinking. And of course, again, going back to the Capitol riots, QAnon was all over that thing too, which is a massive conspiracy theory. It's not there's a connection between conspiracies and QAnon and Christian identity, but that's a conspiratorial type of mindset, surely.
Well, I think there is a connection, and the connection is that conspiracy theory is based on taking a few little tiny facts here and there, or a quote or a snippet of a quote here or there, and using those things to reach a preordained conclusion, right? Like the Jews are evil; they're trying to do us in, or something. So, in that sense, it is like a conspiracy theory, and. I don't know. I mean, the Garden of Eden business with Eve and all sounds like the original conspiracy theory to me.
Yeah. Well, what about the Charlottesville riots or whatever? I guess it wasn't a riot, but it was, a woman get murdered, and these guys are walking down with tiki torches chanting things like "Jews will not replace us." That was an absolutely avowed white supremacist thing, wasn't it?
That's absolutely. And, it is hard to say like where that most comes from, the anti-Semitism of the people we saw in Charlottesville in 2017, but you're absolutely right. Jews will not replace us. Juden raus, right? German for Jews out, and so on. I mean, just explicitly Nazi ideas and symbols and chants. Hail victory, right? Sieg Heil in German. But, there are a lot of things, and I think we've discussed some of them in the past, but that have really pushed the radical right in the United States to becoming more and more and more anti-Semitic. So Christian identity is one of those things, and a very important thing. But just to give an example, between 1994 and 1998, a particular psychology professor, a guy named Kevin McDonald in California, wrote a trilogy of books which purported to show on a scientific basis that Jews are driven by their genes, by their DNA, to undermine the Christian societies, the Christian majority societies in which most of them live. And it goes on and on and on. And I mention this only to mention there are other major factors like that have helped to push anti-Semitism to the very core of the white supremacist right here in the United States. That wasn't true. There was certainly anti-Semitism even in the 19th century in the United States, but it was kind of small time and nothing compared to what you saw in Europe, or certainly saw in the 20th century in Europe. But it grew, and it's a bit surprising that it did grow. And I think that, these are some of the reasons. There are other important things too. I mean, let's not forget that in the 1920s, Henry Ford published the International Jew, 7 years worth of newspaper articles which purported to prove that the protocols of the elders of Zion were true, that the Jews were involved in a massive plot to take over the universe. And let me say, by the way, an important connection, because we're talking about identity, one of the very earliest proponents of Christian identity wasn't really quite identity yet. It was somewhere between British Israelism and identity, but it had already taken on some really racist aspects, fundamental ideas. A very early practitioner was William Cameron. Cameron was the editor-in-chief for Henry Ford at his infamous newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. And Cameron was the man who edited and actually published the International Jew series. So, you can see these ideas were very much kind of kicking around among all these groups in the 20s all the way through the 60s.
Yeah, it's had a long time to germinate. And obviously Hitler was a big fan of Henry Ford, too, wasn't he? He admired Henry Ford greatly. And I think
thought he was the greatest American who ever lived. In 1938, he gave Henry Ford the highest honor that could be awarded under German law to a foreign citizen. At one point he was going to come over and visit with Ford, and that didn't happen in the end. But Ford had a bust of Hitler on his desk. It was a rather nasty relationship.
Yeah, real piece of work. So you got
later Ford tried to take it all back. That's another story. It was complete baloney, but it got to be embarrassing. People didn't want to buy Ford cars anymore, and
it got pretty ugly. So you've got, even though it's not necessarily a huge group necessarily in terms of numbers now, the influence is massive, isn't it? Because I came across Timothy McVeigh. There's some debate as to whether or not he was part of or was aware of Christian identity teachings in the Oklahoma City bombing. Do you know anything about McVeigh's involvement in that movement?
I know a lot about McVeigh. I covered the Oklahoma City bombing as a reporter for USA Today, and also covered the whole trial of McVeigh. No, I don't think that McVeigh was an identity believer. I think McVeigh was something of a white supremacist. He was not fond of black people. We know that from a number of interactions he had when he was in Iraq, when he was back home in New York around Buffalo. For instance, at one point, he joined a Klan group. But saying that makes it sound a little more than what it was. He sent in $15 and got on some mailing list somewhere. And in the same way, people want to say that McVeigh was, very much a part of the militia movement. And he was in a sense, but, he and Terry Nichols attended one or two or maybe three militia meetings in Michigan militia meetings, and that's it. So, he was also influenced by, he thought Area 21 was a real thing, and, he was all curious about UFOs. And so he was a real mishmash of ideas. I have never seen anything that seemed to prove that McVeigh really knew anything about identity. I mean, it's very possible he knew a little bit about it because it was kicking around the West in circles he was running in quite a bit. But, McVeigh was quite a loner. He didn't hang out with a whole lot of movement people. And he didn't spend a lot of time debating ideology, even with the people he did hang out with. So that's the best I can do. My sense is no, not really, although some of his ideas certainly might have been influenced by identity.
Well, and some of the different shooters of like the guy that shot up the synagogue in Pittsburgh and the Poway, California shooter, they also seem to have, well, they certainly were anti-Semitic, so they've got these influences, even though, again, they may not be avowedly Christian identity. It seems like it's had such a massive impact, especially on domestic terrorism. I mean there are some impact.
Cases, where there's no question it was identity. For instance, you may remember Buford Furrow was a guy, I think it was in 1999, if I remember. He shot up in Southern California, in LA, or in a suburb of LA, a Jewish community center. I think he shot 3 children, 3 or 4, who actually survived. And then he went out, walked away from there, and murdered a Filipino-American mailman, postal worker carrying mail on the streets. Buford Furrow had been for years a security guard at Aryan Nations in Idaho. And Aryan Nations was an explicitly Christian identity place. And let me say, just to give a little history on that, Wesley Swift, we talked about briefly before, and was sort of the critical person in the kind of complete radicalization of what had been British Israelism, kind of put the final touches on seed-line identity. Richard Butler was a guy who was an aerospace engineer in Southern California and also a screaming racist who got interested in all of this and went to Wesley Smith's church in Southern California for several years. Smith's church, Wesley Swift's church was called the Church of Jesus Christ Christian. So you can kind of hear what they're saying in the name of the church. Jesus Christ was not a Jew. Jesus Christ Christian.
He was a white guy.
Swift got old and stopped preaching after a while. And ultimately in 1974, Richard Butler took his church, the whole church, and moved to Idaho. And that church became, so Butler ran something called the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, but that was the theological arm, quote unquote, or the religious arm of Aryan Nations. And Aryan Nations, just for those who may not have heard of it, I mean, when I say it was an explicitly neo-Nazi group, I mean they had, German shepherds and barbed wire around their place out in the woods. They had a guardhouse, a whites only. They
swastikas
had
everywhere.
Swastika flags flying over the compound. They dressed up in these faux, these little brown shirt uniforms that were supposed to make them look like big bad Nazis and so on. Ultimately, Aryan Nations was destroyed by a lawsuit from the Southern Poverty Law Center. I was working there when this happened, and it was quite something. But Aryan Nations was incredibly important to the development of the modern radical right, of the contemporary radical right. That is where the Order we mentioned earlier, the scariest white supremacist terrorist group in the history of our country, that's where they came from. They were about 3/4 of them were Aryan Nations members, and they produced a whole string of other murderers, mass murderers, bombers, and so on.
Yeah, huge
and
amount.
Also, because so many people came through Aryan Nations, their influence extended to all kinds of other groups around the country. It was really a poisonous outfit.
Very toxic, isn't it? Yeah. I read somewhere that something like 90% of the domestic terrorism in the United States in the last couple decades has come more from domestic terror than, it's all this Islamophobia, isn't it? Oh, the Islamist extremists and all the rest of it. No one seems to want to label these people domestic terrorists, white domestic terrorists.
Well, I mean, to be fair, that's changed very recently. I mean, Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, recently started to talk about that. But it is, and I would say 90%, by the way, but absolutely since 9/11, 9/11 is a bit of an outlier, right? 3,000 people murdered in a single day. But since 9/11, the bulk, more than 50%, of the terrorist threat in the United States has been from domestic white supremacists, or the domestic radical right.
Yeah, the far
because
right.
It includes people like abortion clinic bombers who they're not white supremacists, but they're murderous people on the right who are willing to kill for their beliefs. So, that now I think is indisputably true. Virtually all law enforcement agencies now agree on that, but it wasn't always so. And maybe it's worth saying that there was a reluctance on the part of law enforcement agencies, very, very strong reluctance to start talking about white people or groups comprised of white people as terrorists. And, there was a certain racism to that. Of course, a lot of it was ideological as well. For instance, in the 1990s, when there were all kinds of doctors being murdered at abortion clinics and bombings going on, the FBI refused to say that people who murdered clinic doctors were terrorists. And it was just ludicrous. I mean, it absolutely fits the precise definition of terrorism, right? You're not just murdering people because you don't like them. You're murdering them as this public act that's aimed at everyone else who would go to an abortion clinic or work at one and so on. Anyway, so law enforcement has not always been good on these things, but I think we've turned a corner in a sense. And, if it hadn't been done already, the Capitol insurrection made it utterly, utterly clear to, anyone with two brain cells to rub together in this country that white supremacy and white supremacist ideology is a real and serious and growing threat.
Well, just like you said, look at the iconography going around on the Capitol riots. You had guys with Confederate flags. Then there's the guy with the Camp Auschwitz hoodie, which they've now arrested him. Another guy had a shirt that said 6MWE, 6 million wasn't enough, which is obviously a reference to the Holocaust. Hitler didn't get enough Jews, 6 million wasn't enough. So then that was all over the Capitol riots.
This, amusingly, is one of those weird little side contradictions of the radical right? On the one hand, there was no Holocaust. The Jews weren't killed. It's all a big story. The Jews tell us
deniers.
And, shake the world down for reparations and so on. And also, at the very same time, 6 million wasn't enough. You're like, well, what is it, right?
Was it a real thing, or was it, I know, on the one hand, they're denying the Holocaust, and then on the other hand, they're saying 6 million wasn't enough.
Bigger and better.
Yeah. Well, this is really interesting. I mean, I know there's a lot more information we could get into on this movement, but if people wanted to find out more about the Christian identity movement, where are some good resources that you would point them to?
Well, you can always find stuff on the web, of course. We wrote some, fairly decent things at the Southern Poverty Law Center, but where I would really refer people to is a book by a scholar, Michael Barkun, Barkun. Michael is by far the preeminent scholar of Christian identity in this country. I frankly don't remember the name of his book, but it's easy to find. He's a serious scholar. The book is everywhere. And that is really the book that lays out the whole history. Now, it's quite a long history and rather complicated. Yeah. So you've got to be a serious searcher if you're going to go through that whole book. But it is fascinating and really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I came across an article. There's a great resources by Barkun online as well. Some articles and excerpts from his book. So even if people don't want to read the whole thing, there's, like you say, he's done some fantastic work. As you say, I've also found articles on the ADL as well as the Southern Poverty Law Center website. So yeah, those are some good resources for people to find out the origins and the kind of the modern day iterations of where this thing has gone. So I know we're going to do this episode. We've got this episode coming out on Doug Wilson. So I'm really interested to hear what people's thoughts and comments are. If people wanted to get a hold of you, what would be the best way to do that in terms of social media?
Yeah, the best way is I have a web page. It's Mark Potok, MarkPotok.net, N-E-T. And I've got a comment form there. It comes right to my email, and I will respond to anyone who writes me.
Okay, I think that's how I got a hold of you.
That's right.
Thanks so much, Mark. I really enjoyed chatting with you once again. If you're up for another conversation, I would love to chat with you another time, and we can maybe talk about something else.
Absolutely. Maybe do paganism or creativity.
Hey, there you go.
Other white supremacist theologies.
There's so much out there. All right. Take care, Mark. Nice chat with you. We'll see you again.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.